So I just want to say what a great honor this is
Likewise.
to share this stage with you.
Thank you
And
so
I
much.
was, thinking that our lives have intertwined in many ways, but not ways in which we would have gotten to know each other. I happen to have met his wife Nina, who's in 1997 in Berlin when we had a tour of the Jewish Museum in Berlin. But you and I was trying to imagine when I was thinking about this, how I would introduce myself to you and how we would have a conversation, where it would possibly happen. And I thought, well, it could possibly happen on the A train in New York, which goes from, you are probably at JFK more than almost any other person alive, and in and out as one of the most peripatetic architects. And then the A train kind of goes all the way up and almost touches the Bronx. And the Bronx are important, I think, for both of us. So I was going to say that we would start at the beginning of the A train in the Rockaways, and the Rockaways are where my husband Joel Hoffman's parents met when they were vacationing over the summer. And so without the Rockaways, we wouldn't have that kind of connection that they gained there in the late 40s and in the early 50s. They had their honeymoon here in Miami Beach. Then we'd continue through Brooklyn and get to Brooklyn Heights and Cadman Plaza, where we were living in 9/11. And Joel's mom had just called us in that morning. We had actually felt the first plane hit. We were very close to the bridge, and neither of us knew what had happened. So Joel went on his way. It was election day in New York that day, and he was head of the Brooklyn Museum's education department, and I went out for a run on the Brooklyn Bridge in my never-ending attempt to stay slim, and then I saw what had happened. It was a gorgeous day, and there was smoke coming out, and the rest obviously is history. But it's a history that then we kind of shared through it was a personal experience, but then obviously your work on the World Trade Center site and how you kind of reimagined it and kind of thought about it as both as a place of memory and a place of celebration, and even how it's come together today is a very important part of that. Of course, if we continued up the A train, we go through Tribeca, where you currently live. We'd probably go under it. We would go, and I'm really kind of loosely using the A train here because we would go through Chelsea. I wrote a book about a Jewish architect, Elijah Khan, who designed most of the buildings, one of the most prolific architects in New York, and prolific in the sense, and the architect of record for the Seagram building, for example. And I was also at the Van Allen, and the Van Allen Institute's a very kind of important place to study kind of connections between people. I did a project that connected everybody along the time zone in playgrounds. So then we continue up, and we get to Morningside Heights, but the A train obviously goes on the east side of Morningside Heights, and I was at Columbia on the west side. So at Columbia, that's really where I first kind of met you intellectually. We were, as a first-year student, I was told to look at and I went there to study with Bernard Schumi, by the way. He had just started the year that I started. And you had just been in with him at the Museum of Modern Art, and in that amazing show on deconstructivism, and then your chamber music series of drawings were drawings that we'd pore over. We would look at these drawings. There was a beautiful set in Avery Library that we would just look at all the twists and turns that you had done when you were at Cranbrook, I believe. And then I had ended up at Columbia because I was an archaeologist before that, in a program in archaeology. And then before that, I'd been an undergraduate classicist at Brown and studied Latin and Greek and applied mathematics. But really it was the Latin literature that got me to thinking about cities and the satires that Juvenal wrote about cities. So I kind of think then about your interest in these connections between places and between disciplines, that you're an architect, first and foremost, but you're always so much more than just that, because you probe into so many different places of human experience to draw, I think, for inspiration. Then we'd keep going up to the Bronx. We wouldn't quite get there because the A train stops in Manhattan, and that's where, obviously, your start in Manhattan and in New York began. Growing up in the Bronx, Joel also grew up in the Bronx when he was a young boy. and my sister, who's an African-American jazz vocalist, also lives in the Bronx. And my family was, 2 of us are black and 2 of us are white, and my parents were among the first families in New England at that time to kind of adopt black children and to kind of create this environment in which kind of people were brought together. So I think that's how I would kind of explain myself to you, but I hope in the process kind of explaining your values, because I know your values are very much in tune with people and places and diversity and all of these things. So I thank you for sharing the stage with me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, that's true. I'm an immigrant. You know, Bronx is where I came to, but that was not my first immigration, because in a way I was born in a place called Poland. My parents were Holocaust survivors. I grew up till I was about 11. I speak Polish, I read Polish, under very dark times. This was communism in its most virulent anti-Semitic form. And we were then the first people allowed to leave on the first immigration to Israel, where Jews were basically expelled from Poland if they wanted to leave. We were so happy, and I discovered a paradise. You know, who could not discover a paradise? Israel was only 8 years old or 9 years old when I came there. It was just a brand new country. And then my father, who had his only surviving sister out of, you know, this is the typical story of the Jews of Poland. 85 members of his family were murdered. I never had uncles and aunts and grandparents, but he had his one sister who survived Auschwitz. I say survived because she was basically a ghost, but he was determined to come to New York, and we came, and I was so lucky to come probably by immigrating on one of the last ships. Right after that, people flew to New York because that was cheaper. But we were able to come to New York on that incredible voyage across the Atlantic.
I just have to kind of interrupt here because I think we might be already misbehaving. We had strict orders that Nina did her best to make me to be undermined, but to show the video, right? And because I think it might cover part of this territory. So can we do that? Okay.
You are born once, but to be reborn again means to be born with a knowledge, with a new reflection on what that initial unconscious sense of being born meant. So it's a recommitment in many ways. And I think that's something that is so fundamental in everyone's life, that it is really the symbolic theme of humanity.
Being a kind of dreamy-eyed optimist doesn't get a lot of things done. But I would say he's both positive and pretty realistic about how the world works. And maybe that comes from his background, which is at one time, of course, was a very tragic beginning after the Holocaust. But primarily, he's a person who wakes up every day and thinks about how wonderful it is to be an American, how wonderful it is to be alive. Yeah, it's a very uplifting experience.
Just look at this library. It has such a broad set of experiences that he brings to this office, and keeps us all fresh and keeps us all young. And I mean that in a very sincere way, that I think he has the most youthful spirit in the office.
He's listening to something beyond just the kind of the basics of architecture, right? I mean, he's obviously very talented visually, right, and composition, and I would even call him kind of an old-fashioned architect in a way, right, because he cares about balance, composition, light, how it sits in an urban setting, context, and his language is one that I think is about discovery.
I don't really know why I use the language. You know, it's like why I like gray more than purple. You know, it's not an intellectual thing. I cannot really answer it, but I know there's something in me that rebels against a certain kind of geometry. I have a certain feeling that I can't draw a certain angle. And maybe Leonardo da Vinci was right, that the acute angle is the angle of strength. It interests me. It seems to be what the world is about.
You're doing something positive per se in the work you're doing, because you're doing something for the people. As an architect, I mean, you're always in the role of creating something forward-looking.
A project is never about itself. It's what it does to the world. It can be a very small and humble place, but it can have a tremendous strength in inspiring people. And what is more important than inspiring a single child with an idea? Nothing can be more important. No military force can compare with a child's a wide-eyed view of the world.
When we came to Berlin, it was very difficult emotionally to make that decision. But it was actually a decision we made in a moment. And it is a road that you come to. And it's not just, do you want to be an architect or you don't? It is, do you want this building to get built? And because it was a building that dealt with a very specific and a very meaningful content, it was a project worth fighting for.
Everybody expected some modest addition to the old building. Daniel came up with this dramatic zigzagging structure that people were totally surprised by. And over the years, I think the role changes and people value it and they understand, what it really does. Not only as a piece of architecture, but also in its surrounding, in the neighborhood where it stands and the spaces that it creates around it.
Just the surface of the Berlin Museum, just the fenestration, the materiality, the uniqueness of its patterns immediately kind of engages the observer that there's something unique about this face that's been projected onto this building. There's something that is out of the ordinary. And then when you begin to associate the visual impact with its content, it allows you not to just sort of make a pinpoint relationship between its content and the artifact. It allows you to actually project yourself and project your own meaning and your own associations.
And that was a very deliberate move on Danielle's part. So the first moment that you're there, you're in the old Baroque building, and suddenly see that this old Baroque building also had a very shocking insertion into it, and that was the staircase that goes all the way down. And again, it was the idea that one had to go through the underground history of Berlin in order to experience what was emerging as the sensibility of Jewish German life above ground. And that underground was very simply 3 roads. The most dramatic, for sure, is the road that leads to the Holocaust Tower, and that road is quite steeply inclined, so by the time you reach the Holocaust Tower, both the ceiling and the road seem to shrink, and it's a compression of space. And what always interested me is that when people would come into that space and the door would close behind, without any prescription by anyone saying you have to be quiet now, they would fall into silence. You were separated and divorced from that experience of being a normal person in Berlin. It was a very real physical experience. How cold it is in the winter, what the light means when it comes through that window, what it means when the door closes behind you, how warm it can get in the summer. These are not experiences that people normally have in a museum, and I think it was an important way of integrating those very physical experiences and very visceral experiences into the museum experience. And then you exit that space and you go into the garden, which are these 49 pillars, 7 by 7, where the earth is contained within the pillar and the vegetation is at the top. It is a ground which is both tilted in 2 different angles, so when you're there, you can get pretty disoriented and you can feel what it's like to be an immigrant or on a ship where nothing seems terribly stable. The third pathway is this very quite steep staircase which takes you up to the top of the building. And as you walk up the stair, you see through the window, of course, the entire lay of the land. You see the Holocaust Tower and you see the Garden of Exile. And then you start walking through the actual exhibits on the 3rd floor. And the exhibits themselves are housed in a building which have these gashes, these windows.
It's a disruption, it's a reorientation, it's a kind of permanent waking up in a new Berlin and remembering that you're not alone, that there are ghosts and shadows that are fully alive around you. Many aspects. So I never considered it just a building that responds to a particular program, but a building that has to create that program through the experience of the visitors, who will have been born in a luckier time. You know, everybody remembers what they did on September 11th, and I remember it very well because it was that morning, September 11th, 2001, when the Jewish Museum opened its doors to the public after 13 years of being in construction and discussion. You know, I won the competition in 1989. Finally, that was the day, September 11th, 2001, the doors opened to the museum, 10 o'clock in the morning, Berlin time. And I went to the studio that morning and I said, you know, I feel totally liberated. It's the first day I don't really have to think about history, Jewish history, because people can now enter the museum. They can make their own judgments. And then, of course, by about 2:30 in the afternoon, Berlin time, it was 8:40 here in New York, we saw those images on the screen. And I suddenly realized that's not a viable statement. History is always going on. There's never such a moment as now I don't have to think about it, because everything is in a strange way interconnected. And certainly at that very moment, I turned to everyone, Carla, Lena, and I said, I want to return to Lower Manhattan. I'm coming back to New York.
What Daniel was most interested in was how to really weave this site also back into the city. So reintroducing the street grid, because the original World Trade Center was kind of an island. So distinguishing the memorial on that 8 acres, and then allowing the street grid to come through, it really makes it more part of New York than the site was previously.
So it's really about a conception of the city, an open, incredibly fantastic city with a cultural sense.
And Daniel had the idea of the towers really creating a spiral, right? They aren't exactly on the New York City grid, so they stand out. And from far away in the skyline was to create a composition, which is, you know, inspired by the Statue of Liberty, that cradles that memorial that's on the ground plane.
One of the most important things that we implemented in the master plan were the footprints of the towers. That experience is about walking around those enormous footprints with 3,000 plus names imprinted into those footprints, seeing how deep those buildings 70 feet below ground were inlaid, and seeing how people look into those waterfalls and think to themselves, my God, these buildings fell with such a resounding clap. And that water falls into those light holes with such a beautiful sound. How incredible and how amazing the sound of that water is compared to the incredible sound of those buildings collapsing.
We saw something we should have never seen, which is the foundations that were revealed, that slurry wall, which is that huge dam that holds the waters of the Hudson from flooding all of the underground of New York.
It's an incredibly moving experience because this was a wall which does stand for resilience, and it was a wall that did withstand the attack. Very few other things withstood that attack.
Ultimately, the most successful sort of measure of ground zero will be how people will go there without necessarily thinking about it as ground zero, but because it's an interesting place in New York City. People will remember it because they like the space, and that's ultimately the most sustainable architecture and the most sustainable urbanism, is to make a place that is memorable.
I'm lucky because I was one of the last immigrants in 1959 to come to New York on a boat, you know, with other immigrants, and that's sort of an iconic, because most people now fly, the immigrants fly, to Kennedy or wherever, but coming on the boat and being woken up early by my mother, about 5 o'clock in the morning, with my sister, and say, go up, you're gonna see New York, and of course you after the voyage you sort of long to see something, and then you see, just like in the movies, really, it's not an exaggeration, the Statue of Liberty coming out of the mists, and that skyline of New York, which there's nothing for an 11-year-old that could even sort of fathom that skyline from pictures or from movies. It's an unbelievable. It's as if you landed on Mars. You cannot believe the heights of buildings. You cannot believe the incredible, extraordinary beauty of Manhattan, and of course that. And arriving on Hudson River and being an immigrant coming out of the boat without the language, not speaking a word of English, that is a fundamental experience of my life. And of course, when I was designing the ground zero, the idea of what to do, I thought that it should really tell that story.
Well, that said a lot. Let's. What I wanted to do was kind of step back to something that maybe the video didn't quite address, and that was kind of your earlier childhood and what kind of brought you to the to some of the, I think some of your earliest memories of Marvel, because you are. I looked at your autobiography, and you're really a person who is able to kind of engage in the outside world at many different levels. And I think the way you described it was you can't really pinpoint which one is going to be the inspiration for a project. But I was wondering if you could describe, your early memories.
I had a whole other, career before I became an architect. I was actually a professional musician on a very, very unusual instrument, a classical musician on a very unusual instrument. I'll tell you the story because it is interesting. It's kind of my fate and my destiny to have played that instrument and done with it what I have done. I was born, as I mentioned, Poland. We lived in a courtyard with a lot of fear, really, from our neighbors. And I wanted to play the piano. And one day, my father, I was young, I was maybe 6 years old. My father brought a suitcase to the house, and he said, "I've brought you the piano." And I just looked at the suitcase. He opened the suitcase, and it was something I never saw before. It was an accordion. And it was because of the fear of the Jews bringing the piano to the house that he brought it in a suitcase. To make a long story short, I became a virtuoso on this very strange instrument. When I came to Israel, somebody said to me, "Why don't you compete in the America-Israel competition for music?" And it's a classical competition. So I came to the Man Auditorium in Tel Aviv, and there were hundreds of young people from the age of 8 to the age of 21, all with cellos, violins, voice, tubas, flutes, harps. I was the only person with a suitcase, and my father was there because I couldn't carry it. It was just too heavy. And I would see the door, in the back would open, and a dejected-looking young person would come out. Obviously, whatever happened in that room didn't work out. I was called into the room. I would tell you the story because I remember it very, very viscerally. My father carried the suitcase into the room, and it was very large accordion. It must have had maybe 4 octaves. It was almost larger than I was. Only my head was visible. And it turned out there were 3 faces looking at me as if I really arrived from a distant planet. And the faces were of Mrs. Kusevitsky, the wife of Sarge Kusevitsky, one of the great patrons of music. Sarge Kusevitsky was the founder of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Zino Francescatti, one of my favorite violinists in the world. And, of course, Isaac Stern, the head of the competition. And they looked with great skepticism at a little boy taking out this thing, strapping. But they stopped smiling after, I transcribed my own music. So I played a toccata in D minor, and I played a number of pieces of Bach. And then I ended with a kind of bravura piece, the, Rimsky-Korsakov, Flight of the Bumblebee, which is technically very challenging. And I still remember they all got up and they shook my hand. And Isaac Stern, this was, I met him later in life a number of times. He told me I was the only person who received this award who did not become famous in music. He put his arm around me and he said, you have to play the piano. You've already exhausted all the possibilities of the accordion. Yeah. Which in a way ruined my life because, I love the accordion. And by the way, I won it the same year together with Itzhak Perlman. There are not a lot of winners. The year before was Barenboim, Daniel Barenboim won. The year after was Zuckerman, only by 5 winners. But that set me on a course of playing an instrument which I loved, but which was forbidden, was a taboo. And by the way, I played in concerts in New York City, in town hall, so with Ashkenazi, with Itzhak Perlman, and the reviews of my music, if you look back in the papers, it was bizarre. Just a bizarre idea of a young person playing classical music with serious musicians, but it was not a joke. It was a true transcription.
How long did you play?
I played it to just... I used to support myself and even my parents to a certain extent. I earned a lot of money when I was 16, 17. Yes, I much more than I earn now. Really, I have to tell you. You play 15 minutes, several short pieces, and really, you're rewarded very well. So. Yeah. Nina once asked me, was it the worst thing was it the biggest mistake I ever did in my life, that I gave up music? And in a way, I feel I didn't give it up, because, I continue to do architecture as a kind of a shadow of music. I consider music the fundamental art. The great basis of what I do is music. And there is a long tradition, as we all know, between music and architecture, not just the word harmony, but proportions, the fact that golden section and the length of strings in the Greeks discovered there was a mathematical a relationship between a visual world and the world of sound. Plus everything that I do, let's say the master plan of Ground Zero, if you really think of that project is a composition not played by me. I'm only the conductor. I'm not even visible on the stage. My back is to the audience, so to speak. But everything has to be very accurate, has to be given also freedom of interpretation. Otherwise, it's a dead end. So there has to be a leeway for musicians, for artists, for architects to be able to interpret that code. The Jewish Museum is based in part on my attempt to complete an unfinished opera by Arnold Schoenberg. Or Aaron Schoenberg, after he came to the United States. I was always interested why he never completed Moses and Aaron. I don't know whether you know this amazing opera. It's very seldom performed because it requires such a huge panoply of talent. But it's an opera which is about Moses and Aaron, and it ends in Act 2 with an aporia, where Moses calls to God. Is there any meaning in all of this? And the notes remained blank. I thought, when I came to Berlin and I thought about, the museum, and before when I did the competition, I actually tried to complete that opera in the echoes of the footsteps of the visitors across the void. The void is a kind of empty space that runs through, it's a disconnected emptiness across the entire center of that museum. So the museum doesn't have an atrium, doesn't have any space that you enter. There's no sense of some redeeming quality to where you are. But there's a segmented emptiness which you cross over and over. And I've listened actually to visitors across it, and it is a kind of an echo of a conversation that Schoenberg himself, and we all do, all human beings have that conversation at some point about the meaning of history. What is the meaning of history? Anyway, so music has been really my way.
I think, and maybe you can touch upon some of your more recent involvement with music and musical performance and engagement with design. Some of those have been really fascinating.
Well, thank you.
Particularly in Frankfurt.
I had a chance. I'll tell you how it happened. I was speaking about my work and in Heidelberg somewhere, and a very large man, Dr. Pauli, I didn't know who he was. He was the intendant of the Frankfurt Oper, which is like the Lincoln Center of Frankfurt. He said to me, I've never heard anybody who knows that much about music. I'm in the musical world. Can you do something? What would you like to do in Frankfurt? So I thought for a minute. It was kind of an idea of architecture, installation, do something in the Frankfurt Oper on the main square of Frankfurt. But I had an instant idea. I said, I have an idea. Of course, we developed it over a long period of time. But my idea was the following: to create about 80 performances in 18 different places in Frankfurt where music has never been played. And I would also program the music. So it was in the main surgical ward of a hospital. Very difficult to get. And he said, well, that one, it's not going to be possible because doctors are not going to give up a hospital space just to have some music in it. But it happened to be that the head of the hospital loves music. He's a lover of music. You know, this is Germany. He said, I'll give up for those hours, I can give the main surgical space. So, I programmed for that space, for example, Marine Marais. I don't know whether you know, he's a French composer of the 17th century. Beautiful piece of music called Surgery of the Gallstone. I mean, it's very painful. They didn't have anesthetic in the 18th century. It's about, the knife cutting into the body. It's about the blood flowing. It's about what the patient feels, what the doctor is doing. I thought that kind of piece of music, which I've heard, perform, has to be heard in a hospital. I mean, in a room, and then I had also to compensate for the painfulness. I had actually a great Indian musician playing a version of healing music, which is, of course, in the Indian ragas as well. So I had a performance in the bunker. I had a performance in the largest swimming pool in Germany. I had a performance of a single violinist, Caroline Widman, who's a kind of a genius. I just wanted one violinist to perform in the largest stadium in Germany. It's a 60,000 person stadium in Frankfurt. And all the concerts were kind of organized. I don't know how the Germans did it. They're so amazing. They permitted me to do all these things. And it was called One Day in Life. And they thought, maybe 2,000 people, 500 people, because I programmed music. It was always a classical piece and always a contemporary piece. I mean, the contemporary piece, I have to tell you, was, I don't know whether you know Lachenmann. Lachenmann is in his 80s. He, to me, is one of the greatest composers living. And I had his performance played in the opera house itself. And it was, 2,000 people. And there were boos. And, because he uses the instruments, the oboe, all the instruments are used not the way they're supposed to be used. They're used in different ways. Instead of, having the mouthpiece for the oboe, you just blow air into the tube itself. Instead of playing the violin, you hit the violin. It's a very complex piece of music. But anyway, I had so much fun. And to me, that was, for example, having music in the subways, in the central station, in the moving cars. And I observed it. Some people thought they just passed by, like in Washington when Bell was playing, as a beggar, was playing, Bach, toccata, and people thought this is just some beggar on the street instead of one of the greatest violinists in the world. Some people just passed by. Others stood with cameras or with their iPhones thinking, this is strange. Others really listened. And to me, that's the city, and that's how you can change the city. You don't have to change the city by building buildings. You can change it by changing how people see themselves and their spiritual whole in the city space. And you can change the city from both sides. Most people think you have to build, but you can build from different sides. And I think music is that kind of thing.
That's such a great description. I really want to follow up on that because it gets back to your early work at Cranbrook, the chamber music. I think you were constantly the chamber works. We were looking for the spaces between the lines, for how you kind of formed and reformed the possibilities of these things. I came to undergraduate. I played in the orchestra and I played clarinet in the Boston Youth Symphony, and Copeland was one of my conductors, and so I had really a strong empathy for this work that you were doing, and I almost think that maybe you can talk a little bit about chamber works in Cranbrook, but I also was interested in how you think that those voids, those spaces between things, helped you to think about maybe your work in Berlin in the Jewish Museum.
Oh, sure.
In Berlin.
Those are my architecture drawings. I looked at, what do architects do? They don't just go out and take 2x4s and a hammer and start building, a hut. It's an intellectual discipline. It's a poetic discipline. It's about mathematics. It's about the cosmic space where you are. So, since I didn't have any clients for many years, I didn't. My first building was built when I was, I don't know, how old was I? Pretty old. I was a late bloomer. But I always thought I was an architect. But, if you look at the works of great masters, they did things before they built. They did drawings. Palladio did an entire sort of encyclopedia of possibilities of mathematics and architecture. He only accomplished few of those buildings, not many. So I had my own Palladian sort of period where I did the chamber works, which was a series of drawings I developed. They are done in the spirit of traditional architectural treatise. There are 14 horizontal drawings and 14 vertical drawings done on large paper with ruling pen, ink. And since I had no client, I had no program, I had no budget, I had no political affiliation, I had no office, I wasn't going to draw imaginary buildings, right? I mean, that's a fantasy that I never had, you know, draw castles and things that could be built in the future. What you could draw is a kind of a structure sort of through the paper, through the ink, a kind of a configuration of possibilities that if you did have a client, if you did have a budget, if you did have a program, if you had a commitment, you could draw out of those lines, out of those traces in between those lines, the buildings necessary in society. And actually, that's what I did. I used those drawings. There was actually somebody who did a PhD thesis, I think in Finland, who proved that all my works come from one drawing.
Wow.
Maybe. I didn't know it, but that was a whole thesis. And he showed in one drawing all my plans, all the things came out. Who knows?
Wow. Was it one of your drawings at least?
Yes.
Oh, okay, okay. So no, that's a really interesting kind of way to think about the idea of drawing and other people kind of studying your work. Are there architectural works that you return to yourself that aren't by you, by other people that you return to study, in the same way that your Finnish colleagues studied your chamber works?
Well, definitely. You know, I'm a student of ancient architecture, but particularly from the Renaissance. I mean, you know, where the drawings really were developed as an instrument, you know, more than the medieval drawings, as an instrument of thought, as an instrument of the future. And, you know, I've studied all the treatises, you know, the great treatise of Guarini, who's the first one to really introduce projective geometry into architecture. Now we have the computer, virtual reality, but it's all based on a mystic in Torino who had this vision of black space. Anyway, yes, I return and marvel at the geniuses that created our worlds and gave us the possibilities. I mean, think of somebody like Uccello. He didn't paint that many paintings, but he established the idea of what does it mean to be in perspective. Of course, other people have written about it. You know, Alberti and Bramante and Brunelleschi. But Uccello, through his practice, created a system of how it could look believable. Because the first, you know, the scheme of perspective does not look believable. The mathematics of it is just a bunch of lines going to a point. So, sure, you're inspired, and you were inspired also by modern thinkers. When I was in Berlin, I particularly studied the early works of Mendelssohn, the works of Luckhard, of Mies, the true Bauhaus inventors, you know. And by the way, I was very lucky because when I went to school in New York. I went to the Cooper Union, and almost many of my teachers were Bauhaus refugees. You know, they came in the late 30s, and they got jobs like part-time teachers in schools. And one of my professors, Hannes Beckmann, who was he was a teacher of color and of form, and I remember he was teaching from a notebook in German. At that time, I didn't speak any German. I always spoke Yiddish at that time. Now I speak German. But he taught from a notebook with notes by Kandinsky and Klee in his margins, you know, correcting the theories, you know. So I was very lucky because it's not always that you have kind of a connection through real people, and how important what you do, what people who teach people, how important education is to create a path in a life. Because, you know, you can't live a life if you don't have a path. And I always thought to myself, most people, especially in business, tell you that you should have a goal. You know, have a goal. You get to the goal. That's what we hear all the time. But my experience is very different. Never have a goal.
Wait,
absolutely never.
If you're going to do that, you have to have a Nina.
Yeah, well,
you have to first have a Nina, and then you never have to have a goal.
Everybody needs a Nina, that's for sure.
No, I think that's the way it works.
But the truth is that that you don't need a goal, you need a path. And the path means that it's kind of an acrobatic act, because you're always going to be pulled to the left and to the right. Get off the path this way, get off the path this way, go this way, go this way. But if you stick to it, it doesn't matter what happens. Something interesting will happen. It doesn't mean success, it doesn't mean anything, but you will discover something for sure on that path. And later on I thought, maybe these guys like in China, the Zen, the Japanese, Buddhists, had this maybe they were on that idea. The Tao, right, is kind of aimless, but not meaningless. Yeah.
Right. On that note, I mean, there are a number of students in the audience I know, and I know you founded a school. And I don't know anything about it, so maybe it's a it's a dark moment in your history. But
No. I found.
But
no.
I've been so fascinated by this.
This is an amazing thing. We on a spur of the moment, we moved 18 times, and I have to say, my partner, wife, Nina, is here, and I would never do what I do without her courage, because, we have kids, and suddenly to just say, okay, it's true. It's true. It's by the way, it's always true that women get no credit, and men talk and they think but really Nina should be on the stage here. She'd be far more interesting than I am. Believe me. It's true. But we moved on a spur of the moment. We just decided, okay, we are now leaving. We're going to sell everything that we possess. We're going to not sell the kids, but keep a few books and just go away and start from zero. And that's how we decided I want to live in Italy, in Milan, particularly Milan.
Are you just to set the stage, are you going from Cranbrook to
No, there was
Milan, or was there something in between? LA or something?
No, there were two things in between. First, I lived in Helsinki, and then we lived in Toronto, and then I suddenly said, let's go to Milan. That's, it was in the 80s. And we're not Italians. We have no family in Italy. We have no connections with Italy of any sort. So we just applied, we went to the embassy, applied for permanent residency to Italy. And said, why? We rented an apartment. Actually, it wasn't me, it was Nina. We had nothing in the apartment, no furniture. We had nothing. We had kids who did their homework by candlelight. We had no electricity for many, many months. And then I said, how can we support ourselves? We have no money. And I said, I have an idea. Let's send out a poster to schools of architecture. Maybe somebody wants to study with me. I have no accreditation. It's not an accredited school, but I have some great friends. I have Aldo Rossi. I have famous architects who are my colleagues, sculptors. They can lecture. They can. So I sent out this poster, and to my great surprise, I got a lot of responses. So many that we created a summer program in Como for about 70 students from around the world, all continents, who to this day are doing some amazing things around the world. I'm still in touch with many of them. So I call the school Architecture Intermundium. Intermundium is a word I discovered in Coleridge. And intermundium means between the worlds. What a beautiful word that can have an intermundium. It's not a mundium, and it's not it's intermundium. And I thought that was, and it was kind of it was a return to sort of a workshop atmosphere of the maybe late medieval period, making things by hand, without any tools, with very primitive means, but with a lot of passion, with love, with kind of craziness. And actually, that's the place where I created the Jewish Museum. There was a competition I did with these few young students from all over the world. And now, the important thing is, it was in our home. Our home was not big, it was only 3 rooms. While the kids had to sleep, and Nina had a small infant, we had to work in another room. So we had to work very quietly by whispering. It was like a shtetl, but we didn't have the cows or the geese or the stuff like that. But it was like that, and it was one of the best experiences I had, because it developed my idea that you can be independent, that you don't have to be dependent, that you can be self-sufficient, that you don't need a lot to do anything, that you need a pencil, a paper, you don't need a lot of anything. But good friends, ideas, some books, music.
let me get onto that. I was just okay. So let's set the stage for me. I'm a student. I'm coming in. I want to work with you. I'm going there. I'm willing to whisper and do whatever it takes to pass through your course. What would you start me on? What did you start students on who were studying with you? Did you have them listen to a piece of music, or did you have them go out and look at some museums?
No.
Or
I don't really even know. It was chaotic. It was crazy.
it was just
There wasn't a program.
It was very real world.
There wasn't like, okay, we're going to do this now. It was sort of probably the way Chagall, Malevich, Libeskind felt in 1915. Yeah, they didn't know what they were doing. The revolution had just happened, and they were there, and they had nothing, really, nothing. It felt a little bit like that. I understood how the five people who did made the Renaissance, and it's true. That's when I met Zaha. That's when I met interesting people who are also just beginning to do something like that. And it was in a way a revolution, because when I was invited to the Constructivist exhibition, I remember being in Philip Johnson's penthouse on top of the Museum of Modern Art, and he looked out of the windows, and he was a weird, strange man. And he, quoting in perfect German, from Nietzsche, just a sentence suddenly. And then looking out at the skyline of New York and saying, tomorrow, everything will be different here. And it's true. I mean, it's kind of strangely true that the next day, it was not anymore, big columns and postmodernism and pediments and arches. It was something else. So I've always really believed that the world doesn't change over time. It changes suddenly. It doesn't change over time. It just suddenly there's a change. I don't know how it happens, but in a moment of time there's a change. And it's not political elections or anything like that. Just a moment of time. I just did an installation in New York with my good friend Daniela Luxemburg, Luxemburg Diane Gallery in Madison Avenue. And she asked me to do an installation of her exhibition of masterpieces of sculpture, Brancusi, Giacometti, Lipschitz, Gonzalez, Matisse, the greatest sculptors, and maybe 14, 18 of the masterpieces that she loaned from museums. And I was so happy to do it, because that's really what life is about. It's kind of...
Oh, wait a second. You can't get away with that. So, okay. So that's like a dream commission.
Yes.
How did you even start thinking about it?
I didn't think about it at all. I had an instant idea to take
Excellent.
To take a chamber work, one line out of chamber works, which is a set of drawings from 1980s. Yeah. I took one line, and I created a line in space on the wall, not on all the walls, but only on the parallel walls that run north-south of the gallery. And it's a very complex line, because sometimes it's interrupted, sometimes it multiplies, sometimes it crosses itself, sometimes it's discontinuous. And I put the sculptures always looking at the line. I illuminated the line with light, and the sculptures not in light, because sculpture has too much light anyway. So leave it kind of in ambient light. Concentrate on this kind of chamber work line. And I arranged the work. She let me, she's fantastic. She let me, and how strange that all the sculptures have names like man, woman, two men, two women. And the last sculpture, which I placed where the line comes to an end and it's interrupted, was a sculpture by Giacometti called "Object to be Thrown Out." It wasn't man or woman or anything like that. It was something like object of anxiety to be thrown out. So sometimes, the visual world organizes worlds that you don't even know about.
And no, that's totally true. And I was wondering, as you were talking about that, how much that kind of process, how much your process has evolved over time, or whether you have had a similar process when you were with your team, first looking at the Jewish Museum as a project.
It's a very interesting question. My process is the same. I was just rereading one of my favorite books. I highly recommend it. Nabokov's Speak Memory. I don't know if you read it. It's the best. It's like Proust, but it's condensed to just a few pages. And he says the following in it. He said, mediocre writers write interesting things because they're influenced by other writers. He says, but great writers like himself, like Proust and Joyce, he said they have nobody to copy. They can only copy themselves. And they are always the same because they can't change. So in a way, you develop the process in depth. It's not about, a scattered, fashionable bunch of things that you can see horizontally, but you delve further into something that you know less and less about. The more you actually work with it, right, the more distant it gets from you. And it's something that I've actually read many artists, particularly in this exhibition that I was doing, because Giacometti said that he was trying to paint a portrait of his brother, but it didn't turn out. He was trying to paint the nose and the eyes, but at the end it was a failure. It didn't look, it did something other than what his intent was. To me, that's art.
Yeah. No, it's kind of interesting because one of the things that I think sounds different from the way you designed the gallery from the Jewish Museum might be the collaboration with other people and the idea that an artist can sit there and, at least us architects think of artists sitting there in their studios by themselves, creating in solitude, getting work exactly the way they want it. And of course, those of us who have practiced in architecture know that there's always other voices, both inside your head, inside your office, outside your office, in the government, in the country, all over in the world. So can you talk about how maybe your process is influenced by the complexities of those voices?
That's a great question. First of all, if you read the oldest existing text, the treatise on architecture by Vitruvius, which is it's a Roman copy of an ancient Greek text, so it's already missing almost everything. It basically says that architecture begins with language. And the story that Vitruvius really gives is that there is a fire. And people shout, fire, fire, and they see the burnt thing, and they come together, and that's when they discover architecture. Isn't that amazing? It's the fire that brings people together through the call for action of some sort. So, sure, you have to be able to express in some way intentions that are not really completely visible. I had that experience at Ground Zero. Because this is an interesting anecdote, maybe,
Go for it.
We did the presentation. There was a presentation in the Winter Garden. All the famous architects, my colleagues, all famous architects. I arrived. We were really primitive because Berlin didn't have any computers. We had slides. And they said, but we don't have a slide projector. We have computers here. I said, really? Okay, you get the picture. I did the presentation. The audience, and there was mostly families of the victims in the audience, in the front. And the audience stood up and applauded me. All the other presentation was quiet. Then when I got off the stage, there were hundreds of newspapermen, media. Nobody came over to me. Everybody came over to the architects who nobody cared about. And I realized suddenly the power of propaganda, of publicity, of marketing. We were just, nobody paid any attention. And I said, well, that's, I didn't understand what it was, but it was clearly a message. But the message didn't end there. We went back to the hotel. We were on our way to Berlin. Clearly, the next morning, the headline of the New York Times was another team had won the competition. It was a large headline in the New York Times. And, we were kind of packing because we were returning to Berlin. That's where we were. And I got a call early in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning. It was John Whitehead, head of the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, said, can you please come right now in the next half hour to the following address? So I rolled up the drawings, Nina and I. All our colleagues were still deeply asleep in some other hotels. And we went downtown. And I went, I was in a room, and I saw the winning team that was announced in the New York Times going by, very famous architects, some of them are my colleagues, going like this. And they said, how does it feel to be a loser? Just like that, as they passed by. So then I heard, there was some commotion, some presentation going on with them in a room next to me. Then 2 people came to my room. Oh, the door opened, and it was the mayor and the governor of New York. Themselves, no other people, just me, Nina, the governor, and the mayor. And they said, "What's your project about?" And I kind of unrolled the drawing. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. And maybe 10 minutes, no more than 10 minutes, explained very quickly what it was. Goodbye, shook hands, went, continued packing, the bags. We were about to leave for the airport about 8 o'clock. It was 6 o'clock. A call came. It was Mr. Whitehead, who said, "Mr. Libeskind, don't believe everything you read in the press. You just won the competition." How strange. How strange is life? How strange is life? So, it's life is forever surprising. It's enigmatic. It's unpredictable. Nothing is ever what you really think it is. Life is more complex than we know about it. And some people believe in God and other forces, but there is truth in all of it.
Well, and one of the amazing things is the way you've at least explained it tonight, the way in which you're uniquely able to pull these pieces together. Because any one of us could have had a musical experience or a design experience or an art experience or any one of the experience, or the immigration experience or the moving experiences, but it's something in your mind that's so strangely beautiful about the way you kind of pull these things together and kind of find meaning in that. And I think I've appreciated this as I've followed you over time, and I thank you very much for kind of going through, because I think you just covered such a broad swath of what it means not only to be an architect but to be a human being, and I think that's so important.
I have to pay homage to Paderewski. Paderewski was the president of Poland, also one of the great pianists. This is what he said about life. He said, "In life, you need the following. You need 1% talent. You need 9% good luck, and you need 90% hard work." And I think that's probably pretty true. You definitely need 1% talent. I had such good luck. And of course, then you need to work very hard. Otherwise, nothing happens.
We are very, very lucky to have you here with us tonight
to
help us experience Miami.
It's so great to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here, and stay tuned for future events.